Good day. Today is Monday, 15th September 2025, and we continue to be in the echo in Britain from the protests that I discussed over the weekend in London. And there's been reports today in the British media that Labour MPs and members of the various trade unions that have historically supported the Labour Party are saying amongst each other and are briefing the media that unless Keir Starmer is able to turn the situation by May of next year, then his political position in Britain will collapse. I have to say that talking about May of 2026, to my mind, is a sign of a staggering complacency on the part of the people who are briefing the media about this. The idea that the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is going to change his personality, change his political approach, connect with the British people in a way that he has consistently proved unable to do, come up with some enormous, brilliant plan for transforming the situation in the British economy and in British society. I should say that plans like that are all over the place. I saw in the Guardian today a very interesting article co-written by one of Keir Starmer's former advisors, which talks about the importance of a root and branch reform of the British civil service. It seems to me to be saying almost the identical things that Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's former advisor, has also been saying. Anyway, you have lots of plans of that kind. The idea that Keir Starmer, of all people, is going to be able to carry out that kind of reform. Bear in mind, he occupied what was essentially a civil service position himself for a long time as Director of Public Prosecutions. The idea that he's the person who's going to radically shake up the Whitehall machine, all of this seems to me total fantasy. What these people who are talking about May 2026 are doing is that they're making the overall position of their own party, the Labour Party, of the government and of Britain still worse, because they are in effect all but assuring that the drift towards the iceberg in which the lumbering British Titanic ship basically currently is, that drift towards the iceberg is going to continue as the captain on the bridge basically hasn't a clue what he's going to do. Well, that's Britain, but elsewhere the situation seems to me to be as fraught in exactly the same way. Now, there have just been regional elections in Germany. They've taken place in various places, but the place which has attracted the most attention is North Rhine-Westphalia, a huge region in central Germany. Now, it happens to be a region I know quite well. It is the area where the Ruhr industrial region is concentrated, where there are great cities like Cologne, Düsseldorf, Essen, which used to once upon a time, long ago, be associated very much with steel making, just saying. As I say, a major industrial and coal mining region, very diverse in some respects, always politically divided between the CDU and the SPD. These were the two dominant parties in the region, and with the very strong industrial manufacturing character of the region, it was for decades dominated by the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, Germany's oldest party, the party which became established in the late 19th century, that used to be led by people like Karl Liebknecht and, well, the Liebknecht and others, the party which was heavily influenced by Karl Marx and for a long time defined itself as a Marxist party, the party that was instrumental in creating the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, the party that played a pivotal role in the politics of the German Federal Republic, the party of chancellors like Willy Brandt, Helmut Schmidt, and Gerhard Schröder, one of the great dominant parties of Germany. And North Rhine-Westphalia, as I said, it's a huge region. Its population of around 18 million is bigger than that of the former East Germany. Anyway, North Rhine-Westphalia was one of its key strongholds. In fact, the SPD governed North Rhine-Westphalia uninterrupted for 40 years, from the mid-1960s until the mid-2000s. They were then the absolute dominant party in this region. Well, that was when German politics had the character that people like myself still find ourselves assuming are the norm. A time when politics in Germany was divided between two big blocks, the CDU-CSU bloc, always perhaps slightly bigger, the SPD, with the Free Democrats, a liberal party, very Atlanticist, with connections to the German military, by the way, being the party in the middle, which would go into coalition with one bloc or the other and basically decide which of these two blocs would form the government of the Federal Republic of Germany. Well, that was then. Today the situation is completely different, because in this former stronghold, which it so long dominated in the regional elections, the SPD has crashed. It now polled just 22% of the vote. It is in clear eclipse, and the rising party, the party that is winning the support of the SPD's former industrial working class voters, is of course none other than the AfD, a party that is often described as far right. Certainly its politics are very different from those of the SPD in many respects, but just as we saw in Britain, just as I commented about that big protest in Britain, that the people who turned up to it seemed to me to be overwhelmingly drawn from the working class demographic in Britain, which once overwhelmingly supported the British Labour Party. So in Germany, in its heartland region, North Rhine-Westphalia, the industrial working class is switching from the SPD to the AfD. And there doesn't seem to be any plan, any idea on the part of the SPD of what they're going to do to prevent this. They have no political strategy for stopping or reversing this drift. On the contrary, I expect that more voices within the SPD are now going to be raised demanding that the AfD be banned. This is the only answer, the only strategy they have to the political crisis that they are facing. And yes, in North Rhine-Westphalia, Friedrich Merz's CDU party continued just about to hold on to its positions. It fell only slightly from 34% to 33% of the vote. 34% was what it had. 33% is what it has now. But I suspect that this is only a temporary effect, the result still of a certain feeling of waiting to see on the part of the CDU electorate what the new CDU Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, might be able to do. I don't think it suggests any long-term prospect for the CDU's success in this region, or indeed anywhere else in Germany. And of course the CDU, as I understand it, governs in North Rhine-Westphalia in coalition with the SPD, and sooner or later, as the SPD rapidly shrinks and declines across Germany, that is going to put the entire stability of the coalition in Berlin, the governing coalition in Berlin, in ever greater jeopardy, and it is also inevitably going to affect the stability of a regional government like the one in North Rhine-Westphalia. Now, it's not difficult to understand why the SPD is losing the support of its working class base. Obviously, issues of immigration, which are talked about all the time, are exceptionally important. One of the reasons why they are important, however, is because what is increasingly happening is that the SPD's working class base considers that it is these issues, immigration and defending the rights of people to enter Germany, take higher priority for the leadership of the SPD than does the welfare of the SPD's historic working class base. And they are becoming increasingly disillusioned, and they're becoming more and more angry. And of course, that brings us back to the key issue, the industrial contraction in Germany, the process of deindustrialization, which is taking hold in Germany. Industrial workers, factory workers, people who work not just in the big factories, but in many of the Mittelstand companies that form the backbone of the German economy, are worried about their future job prospects. Many of them are having to accept either cuts in wages or the stagnation of their wages. They sense that Germany's time as an industrial power, one in which they had a role, an important role, is ending, and they are becoming increasingly frightened and alarmed about this, and they sense that the party, the SPD, that was there to look after them, the party that they, to a great extent, created back in the 19th century, and which they have consistently supported, that this party is now abandoning them. And for that reason, they are drifting away from it, and they are angry, and they are turning inevitably to the AfD, which is talking and does give the impression of being interested in them and in being interested in their concerns and their fears, and which absolutely correctly points to the proximate cause of these problems, which is the economic war. The political class in Germany, including, of course, the SPD, continues to be fixated upon, which is the economic war. Germany, the European Union, the West as a whole, continues to wage against Russia. Now, unless and until this changes, I cannot see how the political class in Germany is going to win back these people. I don't believe it has any intention of changing course, in which case, obviously, it cannot win back these people. But that is part of the greater problem of the political class, not just in Germany, but across pretty much every region of Europe, including, of course, Britain. It's Britain as well, which is that the political class is far less interested and motivated in the kind of things that politicians and politics in all of these countries used to be about: the economy, social security, health, education, law and order, all of those kind of things. It is much, much more focused instead on these narrow issues which not only do not reflect the concerns of those people who voted in that way in North Rhine-Westphalia, but which are actually inimical to their concerns. Now, where is this going to go? As I said, I suspect pressure to ban the AfD is going to increase, just as the British ship, the British Titanic, continues to float towards the iceberg, drift towards the iceberg. So I suspect Germany will continue to do, with the captain, in this case, Friedrich Merz, saying full steam ahead. That's perhaps the difference between him and Keir Starmer. In Starmer's case, one gets the sense of a prime minister who doesn't have a clue. In Germany, one gets the sense of a chancellor who is fixated with just one thing, which is winning the titanic epochal struggle that he imagines he's caught up in, which is the struggle against Russia. Now, in both cases, in the case of Merz, in the case of Starmer, in the case of Macron and Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas, in respect of all of these people, you only have to see pictures of them. The same was true, by the way, previously, of the previous German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. You only have to see pictures of these people when they meet their own publics in their own countries. They always feel distant and uncomfortable amongst their own people. One of the reasons they hold all of these meetings, all of these coalition of the willing meetings with each other, is because ultimately they are only comfortable with people like themselves. And that also explains a lot of the problem and the crisis that we're looking at now. Now, I don't know how this ends. I don't know where this is going. In Germany, at least, I suspect it's going to turn in a very ominous direction. I expect more pressure. And as I said, I personally believe that sooner or later, a decision to ban the AfD is more likely than not going to be made. And in Britain, that is hardly an option. But I do expect the political temperature in Britain to continue to rise very much in the same way that it is doing in Germany and also, of course, in France. I don't see any good outcome to any of this. There is, as I said, the way out. It's important always to highlight that the option exists: end the economic war, seek peace in Ukraine, try to re-engage with your own people, try to focus on their concerns, make the economy and jobs and welfare and education and all of these things your actual priority. But of course the political class is not going to do that, and in the absence of them doing that, it seems to me that things are only going to get worse. And yes, it is likely that despite all of their assertions and all of their claims, the gates into Europe will continue to remain open, because as Spain currently is showing, it is only through attracting people that they're able to maintain even the appearance of economic growth. And a lot of it now is all about appearance and about little else. Anyway, that is all I have to say about this election in Germany. There's been a lot of rumours and talk about the deaths of AfD candidates. I'm going to leave that for others who know more about this than me to talk about. It is disturbing in itself. If it leads eventually to situations where we can see the AfD being banned, that will be, of course, a step that will be seen by many people as a step towards that point. But the bigger story is of a Europe in ever more rapid decline, and a political class that instead of governing its people and being a part of the people, being connected to society in the way that you would expect in countries that still claim to be democracies, shows increasing dislike of the people it governs, and which quite clearly increasingly fears them. Anyway, let's move on to discuss other things. The other event that has taken place is, over the last 24 hours, is an event which I consider interesting, perhaps, rather than important. Interesting, and that is this so-called Yalta conference that has taken place in Kiev. This is a conference which used to bring together many of the important people from the West, where they would meet Ukrainian oligarchs and liberals and people like that in the Crimean town of Yalta. Obviously, since Crimea joined Russia, that can't happen anymore. But this Yalta conference continues. It now takes place elsewhere in Ukraine, and it has just happened in Kiev. Well, one person turned up to this meeting, to this conference, and that was General Kellogg. And we haven't been hearing so much from him recently, but anyway, he was there, and I found his comments actually interesting and very bizarre at the same time. Well, first of all, he said that Russia is losing the war in Ukraine and Ukraine is winning. An extraordinary claim to make, one which people like Mariana Bezuglaya, the Ukrainian MP, other political figures in Ukraine itself, lots of commentators in Ukraine, they clearly do not agree with this incredibly complacent and facile view. But one of the things that really came across to me about this meeting is that, in a sense, General Kellogg's mask has now completely dropped. Because up to now, he has always presented himself as the chief peace negotiator of the United States, appointed to that position by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and as the person who was trying to act as some kind of proponent of an equitable peace between Ukraine and Russia. And if we go back to the article that he wrote back in April 2024, the one in which he outlined his plan, which is basically for a freeze of the conflict in Ukraine, well, it was dressed up as being exactly that, an equitable peace, one where the Russians held on to the territory that they had captured, at least for a time, where there were some steps towards negotiations and improvements of relations between the United States and Russia, where the idea of Ukraine eventually joining NATO was delayed, postponed, not completely cancelled. That supposedly was going to be a concession to the Russians and to President Putin himself. And, well, the article did talk a lot about the importance of talking to President Putin in a respectful way, acknowledging that he was the serious leader of a serious country and all that sort of thing. It was, as I said, a very moderately worded article, even if the content was not such that the Russians could ever accept or would feel was moderately conceived at all. Well, over the course of General Kellogg's visit to Ukraine, it became absolutely clear to me, and I think to anybody objectively listening to him, that he is 100% on Ukraine's side in this conflict. He announced himself again to be an advocate of massive sanctions against Russia. By the way, in the April 2024 article, he was also talking about the need to increase sanctions pressure on Russia if the Russians did not agree to the freeze of the conflict that he was advocating. Anyway, he was basically demanding and insisting on that, and he admitted his enormous influence over the president, the fact that it is he who has been feeding information to the president about the progress of the war. And, well, I have to say this, though General Kellogg didn't actually say this exactly, I got the sense that what General Kellogg has been mostly doing since before the presidential election is passing on to Donald Trump the things that the Ukrainians want him to know. So I suspect these extraordinary figures for casualties, Russian casualties, that President Trump comes up with have been provided to him by General Kellogg, who has in turn obtained them from the Ukrainians. I want to stress, I don't know that, but I believe it is true. It is General Kellogg who probably has been telling President Trump that the battle, the fighting in Ukraine is in deadlock. It is General Kellogg who has been badgering Trump to intensify the sanctions against the Russians, and who has been assuring Trump that Russia's economy is in a bad way and that it cannot withstand the sanctions pressure. Well, it's absolutely clear to me what a pivotal role General Kellogg has been playing in giving the president advice, and as is fairly obvious, in my opinion, completely the wrong advice. I got the first real sense of this some months ago when, after one of his trips to Moscow, Steve Witkoff advised Trump that the simplest and fastest way for the war in Ukraine to end was if the United States and Ukraine were to accept Vladimir Putin's proposals, Istanbul Plus, the proposals that Putin laid out in his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June, 2024. And the reports at the time said that Kellogg strongly pushed back against that, telling Trump that the Ukrainians would not accept it. So, in effect, Kellogg already at that point was advocating for the Ukrainians to Trump and was basically telling Trump that he should accept a veto, a Ukrainian veto, over whatever peace plans emerged out of America's own interactions with the Russians. The other disturbing thing, I find it disturbing, that General Kellogg also said, is that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is on side with him. It looks as if the military leaders in the Pentagon continue to be, at least at the level of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, continue to be fully committed to Project Ukraine. The generals, they continue also, despite all of the military failures, the failure of the 2023 summer offensive that Ukraine launched, which, as we now know, American generals mostly commanded. Anyway, despite all of that failure, the generals have learned nothing. They continue to insist that the war be continued in the same way, more weapons, more sanctions, all of those sorts of things. They are uniting with Kellogg, apparently, in pressuring Trump to take this hardline stance and to stick to what are ultimately Biden-era policies, and who, in my opinion, are continuing to play a role in committing the United States to an ever worse and deeper debacle. Now, what I would say about all of this is that Donald Trump, it seems to me, has had a consistent weakness for listening to generals. He appointed a general, General Mattis, to be his first defense secretary during his first term. He appointed another general, General McMaster's, at one time to be his national security advisor. He did so, by the way, on the advice of none other than Senator McCain. He went with yet another general, General Flynn, to be the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Perhaps I should say that General Flynn did have somewhat different views on some issues than perhaps some of the other generals have done. And, well, we see again that he's listening to General Kellogg over Ukraine issues, and General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as well. Now, those who are familiar with America's wars will know that the generals never advise retreat from them. Their consistent advice is to double down. That's what they did during the war in Vietnam. They were coming along to President Johnson, and throughout the early part of the Vietnam War, and they were demanding that President Johnson send more and more American troops to Vietnam. And they were constantly telling President Johnson that if he sent a few more troops, that would be enough, and that the Vietnamese were suffering unbearable losses, and victory was certain if he did that. And they continue to do that. And I think it is now widely accepted that they were telling things to Johnson about the progress that they were achieving in Vietnam, which was knowingly untrue. They did exactly the same with the Iraq War. They were the people who advocated the surge in Iraq. They insisted that, the American commitment to Iraq must be continued indefinitely and escalated even. They also resisted every single piece of advice or suggestion that the United States work out a proper negotiated exit strategy from Afghanistan, with the result that that conflict in Afghanistan continued for 20 wasted years, with the United States ultimately forced to withdraw, but doing so in the most disorganized and bungled way, with the most catastrophic consequences. And when President Trump wanted to pull US troops out of Syria, the generals played a part in sabotaging that as well. This is, of course, also in his first term. Perhaps it's unsurprising the generals don't like to retreat or to acknowledge that wars are not going well and are being lost. Perhaps one should expect that from generals, but that is perhaps an even better reason for not listening to them too much, for understanding that political decisions about war and peace, questions and war and peace, are best not left with generals. After all, it was Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister during the First World War, who once said that war is too important to be just left to the generals. So I would suggest to President Trump that he exercise a lot more skepticism about what General Kellogg is telling him. In fact, I would go further still. I would say that General Kellogg has led him entirely on the wrong path. It's long overdue for the president to call in General Kellogg, have a meeting with him in the Oval Office, thank him for all his wonderful service, and tell him that his services are no longer needed. I think that the president, in order to extricate the United States from this war, which is clearly what he wants to do, should stop listening to people like General Kellogg, who, like all American generals, or maybe not all American generals, but most American generals in most recent conflicts, have only one answer to any problem, which is to commit even more. Well, speaking of Trump, he has, of course, been speaking himself, and he's made further comments about how he feels that the Europeans have not been pulling their weight, how they haven't imposed on Russia and its trading partners the massive sanctions and tariffs and things that they should have imposed, how they continue to buy oil and gas from Russia, and why should the United States make efforts to clamp down on the Russians and jeopardize its relations with the Russians when the Europeans are not doing so. Trump has been essentially repeating the comments that he made in that Truth Social post that I discussed at length in my program yesterday. And one can understand why, because the pressures in the United States from the hardliners are still there. Lindsey Graham, who is every bit as obsessed, or so it seems to me, with Ukraine as the European political leaders are, has come up with a new plan to get his scheme for bone-crushing sanctions against the Russians and the countries that trade with Russia passed. He wants to attach his bill, the Blumenthal-Graham bill, to the budget and to package it all together in the budget and to send it in that form to Donald Trump. Now, Graham doing all of this, despite all of the steps that Trump has been taking over the last few weeks, despite Trump meeting with Putin, having conversations with Putin, despite Trump indicating that he's not so keen on sanctions, despite Trump's latest comments in his Truth Social post, and now made verbally, that he's only really willing to move forward with sanctions if the Europeans do. Lindsey Graham engaging in these parliamentary manoeuvres, to my mind, shows quite conclusively that he is not Donald Trump's actual friend, however happy they appear to be when they are together. He flatters and works on Trump, much in the same way that European leaders do, and by the way, General Kellogg does, basically in order to try to get Trump to recommit to Lindsey Graham's obsessive project, which is defeating Russia in Ukraine. So Trump obviously has to contend with this problem, and his comments that he's not willing to move forward with sanctions unless the Europeans move forward with similar bone-crushing sanctions is an indication of this. And an interview that the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Speaker Johnson, has now given, I think reinforces this, because Johnson has said that though it is certainly correct that Russia needs to be sanctioned in some form, the kind of sanctions, the bone-crushing sanctions that Lindsey Graham is talking about, cannot be implemented against the wishes of the President of the United States, Donald Trump, which must be taken to mean that if Lindsey Graham does want to move forward with these sanctions, Johnson is going to take steps to stop that happening in the House. So one could see the political movers that are taking place. Now, what for me makes all of this really incredible, indeed surreal, is that, of course, India has already pushed back hard against sanctions. They've already confirmed that they're going to continue to buy oil from the United States, from Russia, that they're going to defy the tariffs that the United States, Donald Trump, has imposed on them. And there's been much heart searching and hand-wringing in the West about how the sanctioning, the tariffing of India in that way has consolidated BRICS and has encouraged India to move away from the United States and move still closer to China and Russia. There's also today been a very sharp response from the Chinese Foreign Ministry to all of the threats from Donald Trump. to impose massive tariffs on China if China continues to buy Russian oil. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has again made it clear that China does not take kindly to these kind of threats, that it is absolutely not going to heed them, and that if the United States is foolish enough to act on these threats by indeed imposing heavy tariffs on China, China absolutely will reciprocate. In other words, it will impose tariffs against the United States of its own, and it's almost certainly going to do, in fact, it is definitely going to do what it did back in April, which is stop supplies to the United States and to the West of rare earths. And yes, workarounds for shortages of rare earths can be found. Yes, there are stockpiles in various places. Yes, it is probably true that certain goods that are made today with using rare earths can be made perhaps less efficiently without rare earths. But nobody should be in any doubt that this is going to be a problem for the United States, for the West's manufacturing economies, and that there is no simple solution to it. Now, one would assume that Lindsey Graham knows all about this. One would assume that Lindsey Graham understands that the kind of economic war against Russia that he seems intent on waging on Ukraine's behalf is going to have massive negative consequences for the United States itself. And yet we see that he still wants to go on. And he continues to have, apparently, a significant amount of support behind him in the Senate. I was talking earlier in the program about how the political class in Europe is fixated on certain things, specifically on the conflict with Russia in Ukraine, to the point where they have lost interest in the welfare of their own countries and their own populations. It seems to me unavoidable to say the same thing about Senator Graham and about those senators who support him in this cause. They seem far more obsessed with their conflict against Russia. That seems to me, to be far more obviously their priority than the well-being of the United States and of its people. I find it extraordinary. I find this quality of obsession incomprehensible and almost beyond my understanding. But there it is. Now, Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, earlier today, made a truly remarkable comment over the course of his daily briefing to the Russian media. He was asked about whether Russia is at war with NATO, and he said, yes, it is. NATO is at war with Russia. It's evident, and it doesn't need any additional confirmation. NATO is de facto taking part in this war by providing direct and indirect support to the Kiev regime. NATO is at war with Russia. That is what Vladimir Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said in Moscow this morning. And, well, you can see why he would say this, because the only explanation for this obsessive behaviour on the part of Lindsey Graham and the other hardliners in Washington and the hardliners in Europe is that despite their protestations, they too consider themselves to be at war with Russia. Of course, when countries go to war with each other, the only priority is to win the war. Everything else takes second or third place. One expects losses and sacrifices to be made because one's objective is not to mitigate or end those losses or sacrifices. It is to achieve victory. And that ultimately explains to me everything. It is why people like Merz and Starmer and Macron and Lindsey Graham and Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas, and by the way, Annalena Baerbock, who's now in New York, but she's made further comments to this same effect, all are so willing to sacrifice the welfare of the peoples of America and of Europe. It is because though they deny the fact publicly and continuously, all of them collectively believe that they are at war. And going back to General Kellogg, the mantra that Ukraine is winning the war and that Russia is losing it is again the sort of thing you would expect people who believe themselves to be at war to say. They don't want to acknowledge or to admit even to themselves that they are losing, because of course doing so is defeatism, and it calls into doubt the viability of the entire enterprise and the prospect in the end of achieving victory. Again, Peskov is right, and it is clearly something that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, needs to understand. Over the course of his various comments, the comments that he made over the last few hours, the President has spoken about the intense loathing that exists between Zelensky and Putin. I'm not sure, by the way, whether Putin exactly loathes Zelensky. A point which perhaps is worth bearing in mind is that there have been ample opportunities for the Russians to kill Zelensky. They know where he is most of the time. They've tracked him. There was an instance when he turned up in Odessa with the Greek Prime Minister, Kostas Mitsotakis, with him. And they were being monitored by a Russian drone. And obviously, if the Russians at that point had wanted to kill Zelensky, a missile strike using a ballistic missile whilst they were keeping track of Zelensky's movements would have been an option. The reality is that Putin has up to now consistently rejected the very considerable political pressure in Russia to set out and assassinate Vladimir Zelensky. And in fact, he's actually defended himself about this. He's actually said in a broadcast heard on Russian television, this is comments he made to the Russian media, that it was not in Russia's advantage to assassinate Zelensky because Zelensky is irrational, he makes crazy and decisions which work against Ukraine's interests. So why would Russia want to assassinate a Ukrainian leader like that and replace him with someone a lot more intelligent and capable, who might start making the correct decisions on Ukraine's behalf rather than the wrong ones? I'm not sure I completely believe this explanation of Putin's, by the way. But the fact does remain that he has had the opportunities, Putin has had the opportunities to have Zelensky taken out, and he's never sought them. Whereas on the Ukrainian side, one could see that the Ukrainians have, as Zelensky's intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, frankly admitted that the Ukrainians have made several attempts to assassinate Putin, all of which, however, by Budanov's admission, have obviously been unsuccessful. Putin is still there, he is still alive, he continues to be president of Russia. All of that suggests to me very strongly that if there is loathing between Putin and Zelensky, it is on Zelensky's side towards Putin, not on Putin's side towards Zelensky. Anyway, Trump has talked about that, but it seems to me that though he's getting some glimmer of the realities, it's clear to me that Zelensky and the political leadership in Kiev do genuinely loathe Putin. What Trump needs to understand, and what he has never really understood, is that these people that he's dealing with in Ukraine, but also in Europe, and people like General Kellogg within his own entourage, they consider themselves to be at war. They consider themselves to be at war with Russia and with Putin himself, and they are not going to let go until they're either completely defeated or they achieve victory. Now, I've sensed this certainly since the summer of 2022, when the Western powers, Biden and Boris Johnson, sabotaged the Istanbul Agreement. It's been obvious to me that these people consider themselves to be at war. It was why they pushed Ukraine into the summer 2023 offensive, for example. The kind of demands for Russia's complete capitulation that the Ukrainians came up with and which the Europeans supported was only made sense in the context of people who do believe themselves to be, in effect, at war. I don't think Trump himself has ever really understood this. And I think that this is why he has made so many mistakes and false starts, and why he has found himself, to his bewilderment, still trapped in this crisis in the way that he clearly doesn't want to be. Well, we'll see whether the realization does ever dawn on him. I still believe, it is still in fact my firm view, that attaching the idea of American sanctions and tariffs and all of those things against Russia and its trading partners to what the Europeans are going to do is Trump's way of trying to bury this whole idea of saying that the United States cannot reasonably be asked to do that thing which the Europeans are not doing. But given that the Europeans, at least the key European leaders, Starmer, Macron, Merz, Ursula, Kaja, Kallas, to some extent I suspect Meloni as well, and others, do believe themselves to be at war, I think that it's a gamble. It's possible that these people, so fixated as they are, as I said, on achieving victory, would be prepared to take this disastrous step of imposing these massive sanctions against China and India and all of those other countries. Because, as I said, if you believe yourself, if you work yourself up to the point where you think of yourself as being in a war, winning victory is your priority, and the collapse of your own economy at that point becomes, if you like, a secondary issue. So there we are. Now, it must be said that there are still some voices of relative, well, I won't say sanity, at least realism. And one of them, somewhat surprisingly, is the Polish Foreign Minister Alex Christoforou, who has also been in Ukraine. I believe he's attended this very same conference. And he said something. Sikorski, in my opinion, is I consider him an dyed-in-the-wool neocon. I consider him one of the most hardline figures in Europe at the present time. But nonetheless, I do acknowledge that at a certain level, he is an intelligent man. Anyway, Sikorski actually said something extremely interesting. He said, why are we even wasting time talking about security guarantees for Ukraine? Why are we Europeans even floating this idea? What security guarantees implies is that we are all in Europe prepared to go to war with Russia to defend Ukraine. Well, 3.5 years have passed, and we can see that we are not prepared to go to Russia, to go to war with Russia to fight Ukraine. So why are we pretending to each other, going through the motions of pretending to each other, that we will ever do this? Now, Sikorski is obviously right. It makes all of those discussions, I mean, he has just exposed all of those endless meetings that Macron and Starmer have convened together, the coalition of the willing meetings, as the total nonsense that they actually are. And Sikorski has incidentally also floated the idea that Poland and other East European and NATO countries might start taking steps of shooting down drones and missiles, Russian drones and missiles, inside Ukraine, if it looks as if they might filter their way across the border. But the reality is that we're now several days from the drone incident, which I've discussed at inordinate length and don't propose to discuss again. And well, notice that nothing like that is actually happening. Nobody seems keen to send their aircraft or their air defense missiles into Ukraine to shoot down Russian missiles and drones there. They all understand that if their fighter jets were to enter Ukrainian airspace in that way, the Russians, with their extremely effective air defense system and their powerful air force, would come after those very same NATO fighter jets, and nobody really believes that if their fighter jets were shot down, this president, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, would truly be willing to come to their rescue. So there it is. People who believe that they are at war, but are not prepared to take the plunge. They want limitless sacrifices from their people, and of course, almost literally limitless sacrifices from the Ukrainian people to keep the war going until they eventually win, but who don't want to risk going themselves into battle because they know if they do, that the risk they run is that they will lose, and not just lose in terms of being defeated in Ukraine, but that they will lose NATO itself, because if the United States doesn't come to their rescue, and none of them seriously believes that it will, then of course the entire rationale for NATO is gone. NATO itself is exposed as a bluff, and at that point it collapses. So it's the worst of all wars, a war where we do extraordinary things to ourselves and far worse things to Ukraine in pursuit of a victory we will never win and can never win, because it is a war in which we know we cannot fight. I said that there are voices of reason and rationality still in the West. I've been again reading some extraordinary questions that Lord Skidelsky has been putting in the House of Lords to the British government. Questions which deserve answers, and which all go ultimately to the point that I am making. Questions which never get serious answers, because one gets the sense that Lord Skidelsky is putting factual, rational points to people who cannot listen to them, because their position makes ultimately no rational sense. It is an extraordinary state of affairs. It's one which, well, I've often said that it can't be sustained indefinitely, but certainly it is one which cannot by definition have, in the end, a good outcome. Anyway, I am now going to turn briefly to the situation on the battlefronts. And here I have to say that there are fundamental differences, very fundamental differences, between the way the Russians are reporting the situation and the way the Ukrainians are in what is, I still believe, probably the most important battle of all, which is the one that is taking place in Pokrovsk. So the Russians, for example, claim that the situation in Pokrovsk is going their way, and that they expect this place to fall, and that the Ukrainians there are becoming encircled. Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, the Russian-backed political entity in Donetsk, says that Battle Group East, Group of Forces East, are helping with their actions the group of forces working in the Pokrovsk direction, as we see urban battles there. In addition to urban battles, we see a gradual envelopment of the Mirnograd agglomeration in particular. And he said this in an interview with a reporter, Andrei Rudenko, which has been posted on Telegram. And Pushilin also said that in terms of the area of the Russian breakthrough, northeast of Pokrovsk, the salient made by our troops in the Dobropolye direction remains. Of course, the enemy is constantly trying to counterattack or attack individual positions, trying to cut them off, but nevertheless, our units are still there. They continue to grind down enemy groups, including elite units. So that is what the Russians are saying. They're saying that overall, they're holding their positions in northeast, in the area to the northeast of Pokrovsk, where there was the big Russian breakthrough in August. Yes, the Ukrainians are conducting counterattacks in that very area, but their counterattacks overall have been unsuccessful, and the Russians still hold the strategic initiative in this location. The Russians also say that they're gradually increasing the pressure on Mirnograd. Perhaps some of their troops are already in Mirnograd, in the northern part of Mirnograd, but they're now battling to enter the southern part of Mirnograd as well. The Ukrainian counterattack, which briefly captured parts of Novoekonomichny, has been repelled, and the Russians now have complete control of Novoekonomichny again, and all of the surrounding territory of this important village. And here I think the Russians have video footage which basically confirms what they're saying. And we have Pushilin saying that the whole territory, Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, is being enveloped, in other words, surrounded. And this is consistent with the claims that we've been getting, for example, from Radovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, which has many sources on the ground, as I've said, that the Russians have crossed the main road, the main supply road that passes into Pokrovsk and Rodinska, that they have troops located just outside the Ukrainian-held village of Grishinyo, which is located just north of the E50 road, and that the Russians have captured Udachny to the south of this road, and there is clear video footage to confirm this, though no confirmation so far from the Russian Defense Ministry, and the Russians are in the process of storming the Pokrovska mine to the north of Udachny and to the south of the E50 road. Now, this is what the Russians are saying. The Ukrainians, for their part, are telling us a different thing. They are saying that they have made attacks, they continue to make attacks, basically in the eastern area of the Russian breakthrough, that they have captured or recaptured the village of Vladimirovka, and there is video footage which appears to confirm at least part of this, that they've made further advances south of Vladimirovka, and that their counterattacks continue. Well, these two accounts are not completely in contradiction with each other. The Russians do concede that the Ukrainians are counterattacking, but they say that the counterattacks overall are unsuccessful. And it is a fact that the Ukrainians have not been able to roll up the entire territory of the Russian breakthrough. The Russians still appear to control Kucherev Yar. They still have troops either in parts of Zaloty Kolodyaz or very close to it. They still appear to control most of the territory that they're shown to have captured. The big question for me is not perhaps what is going on in this area of the breakthrough, where it's clear that an intense encounter battle is underway. My overall sense is that the Ukrainians are basically stuck, that they're not making the kind of advances that they need to make in order to roll this Russian breakthrough back. The big question is whether what the Russians are telling us about the situation in western Pokrovsk and in Udachny and north of Udachny in the Pokrovsk mine and outside Grishinyo, whether any of that is true. There's been no Ukrainian reports that I know of that admit to any of this. General Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, showed a map which appeared to support at least some of the claims that Radovka was making. It did appear to show Russian troops just outside Grishinyo, but this map is now about a week old. So, for me, what is actually going on in the Pokrovsk area really depends very, very much on whether you believe what the Russians are saying about the fighting south and west of Pokrovsk and within the western parts of Pokrovsk, where the Russians claim that they have captured, well, practically the entire western side of Pokrovsk. It's whether this part of the Russian claims is true. I've noticed that the Ukrainians so far are not straightforwardly saying that these Russian claims are false. They're leaving us with that assumption. And, well, I have to say that in terms of the fighting around Pokrovsk, Radovka at least has, as I said in the past, tended to be right when it has reported the events that are taking place there. They appear to be getting some support over the last 24 hours from these comments by Pushilin. And if these reports from Radovka and from other Russian sources are true, then the situation in Pokrovsk is becoming critical for the Ukrainians, and their counterattacks are perhaps in the wrong place, probably not from their choice, but because of the contours of the battle and the crisis in Pokrovsk is not that far. Well, that's the situation in Pokrovsk. As I think I've made clear, both in this program and in earlier programs, I lean to the Russian view. Anyway, elsewhere, I don't think there is any actual doubt about the situation. The Russian advance in Zaporozhye region continues remorselessly from the east. The Russians continue to push west. It's been pointed out that the Russians are now coming up against a whole series of rather denser habitations, Gulyapolye, Poltavka, Velikomikhailovka, Uspenovka, and these being significantly bigger and perhaps better fortified places might be more difficult places for the Russians to capture than the small villages they have been rolling through remorselessly up to now. And that may be true, and it may be that over the next couple of days, as the Russians reach these larger villages, their advance will slow. The one thing I would say is that, yes, the Ukrainians might be able to hold the Russians back in these bigger villages, but apart from Gulyapolye, which is located in the south, and which is undoubtedly a town, all of the other places are nonetheless villages. And it is going to be very difficult, it seems to me, for the Ukrainians to hold them indefinitely, particularly in this landscape where the Russians control all the territory around them. But anyway, we will see what happens. Further east, in Zaporozhye itself, there is now more video footage and admissions from the Ukrainians that the Russians have indeed broken into Stepnogorsk, the center of Stepnogorsk, that heavy fighting is taking place there, and the Russians are inching closer to the city of Zaporozhye from the south, and my guess is that their ultimate plan is to establish drone control of the main supply roads from Zaporozhye, the city of Zaporozhye, to the Ukrainian forces further east, including these Ukrainian forces, which presumably will try to defend these villages. So anyway, that is the situation in Zaporozhye region. Elsewhere, there have been more reports that the Russians have captured more territory around Kupiansk. The fighting around Kupiansk is increasingly reminding me of the fighting in places like Selidovo and Ugledar, and by the way, Avdiivka. The Russians have now established a strong presence in most of the town. There are still apparently Ukrainian forces holding out in various positions. That is what we were told yesterday by TASS. It'll no doubt take some time to push them out, but the Russians seem to think that this is a rear guard and that the Ukrainians are going to withdraw from Kupiansk fairly soon. Well, we'll see. It would be wise for the Ukrainians to withdraw from Kupiansk fairly soon. It would be the thing they ought to have done, for example, in the Battle of Ugledar, when they should have withdrawn the two brigades that were defending Ugledar before Ugledar was effectively surrounded and the Russians broke into the town. But of course the Ukrainians didn't do that. The fighting in Ugledar as a result was prolonged, but the Ukrainian losses were much higher, and at least one of Ukraine's best brigades was so badly mauled that it has never properly recovered. And, well, the Ukrainians have done that in place after place, and there has to be a chance that they will do the same in Kupiansk as well. And it is likely, or so it seems to me, that they're going to do the same in Seversk. Again, it's not entirely clear exactly what is happening in Seversk. There's been quite a lot of drone footage, but it's taken from a distance. It doesn't show the fighting inside the town closely. But I suspect that there is now actually, as Gerasimov said, fighting certainly close to the northern boundaries of the town. I'm guessing in the town itself. And there's further evidence that the Russian army has pushed south and reached the village of Yampol, which lies on the main supply roads, close to the main supply roads to Seversk, west of Seversk. And again, one would have thought that if Yampol were at risk of falling, which it clearly is, that the Ukrainians would by now realize that it makes no sense for them to sacrifice men of whom that they are in short supply, particularly trained men, to hold on to Seversk, and that the point has now been reached when they should pull back. But again, is that realistically what Zelensky and Sikorski are ever going to allow or ever going to do? So again, the pattern of Ugledar is likely to repeat itself. These actions of the Ukrainians to hold on till the bitter end to lost positions, I've discussed this many times. All they do is sacrifice men for nothing. But it's not as if the Ukrainians ever seem to learn from this, and holding on to these lost positions seems to be important to them because it means that they can tell somebody like General Kellogg that they're winning the war when it is perfectly obvious to anybody who follows it closely that, on the contrary, they are losing. Now, let's say that also there's further reports that a major Russian strike on Ukraine's energy facilities is now apparently in preparation. Massive drone and missile strike, and the electricity war, what John Helmer has referred to as the electricity war, is about to resume, and resume in earnest. And Ukraine's air defences are now so depleted that it's difficult to see what they can do to withstand it. All this time and energy talking about sanctions, tariffs against China, security guarantees, which Radek Sikorski, no less, is telling us are going to be worth the paper that they're written on. No-fly zones, as some people again, Sikorski himself have been talking about. Military deployments to Western Ukraine. All this time and energy doing these things as Ukraine is being destroyed and as the European economies gradually break down, and as political energy in the West, in Europe, starts to migrate, to leave the political class behind and move towards new forces. Nigel Farage's Reform Party, the AfD, Marine Le Pen's grouping in France. All of this energy focusing on these surreal, utopian things, as everything else goes to pieces. I've often said this. I'm going to finish this program by saying it again. When this conflict is eventually written down in the histories, the historians are going to be amazed. Anyway, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Please remember, if you like this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.